Over the past few months, I have really been struggling with fatigue. And this isn't out of the ordinary because part of it is a result of the radiation treatment that I had for my thyroid cancer. But what I found is that I had to manage my calendar and my time, but I also had to end up managing my energy. For example, if I had a meeting in the evening where I had to be out and do something, or even on Zoom have a meeting, I would leave the office a little earlier in the afternoon, go home, have a nap, and then just to ensure that I have enough energy for that meeting. At my last appointment with my oncologist, we were talking about this, and he said to me, he goes, "You know what, Brent, I think there might be something else going on besides the effects of the radiation. You probably shouldn't be this tired by this point." And so he encouraged me to go to my GP. So I went to my GP and we talked it through, and he gave me a bunch of blood tests to go through, gave me some psychological tests to go through. He even made me, for the first time in my life, do a stool sample. And so all those tests came back negative, basically. You know what? I don't struggle with depression. I'm not struggling with anxiety. My liver, kidney functions are all normal and good. And for those of you who are interested, even my colon is healthy. And so as we sat there and talked about the results of this, he said, "Brent, you know what? Despite you having cancer, all these other things tell me that you're healthy and your body is in a good spot. I'd give you like an A, maybe even an A+. For that." And so then I'm thinking, okay, so what is going on? If there's not a medical reason and even some of the psychological reasons, why do I still feel so fatigued? After a number of conversations with people, I think I've come upon one possible solution to this, or one thing that may be causing this. And I think what it is this prolonged crisis we've been in called COVID. As I've talked to other church leaders and leaders who lead organizations, business owners, even people who manage departments and healthcare workers, even people who lead families, almost year and a half we've gone through with constant change and having to come up with new things or doing things differently, and then dealing with people's opinions and often polarizing opinions, it wears on you. And so I wonder whether some of that is causing the weariness I feel, and maybe the weariness you feel. But this is one of the things I have noticed in my experience in life. Weariness in life often leads to weariness in the soul. And when that happens, that becomes a dangerous thing for us as Christians. And so this morning I want to look at a psalm where David is weary. And we want to look at how he deals with his weariness. So we're going to look at Psalm 63 today. And I want to start by just reading the first verse. And it says this: "You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water." If you read the first part just below the heading of Psalm 63, you'll see that this is a psalm of David and that he wrote it when he was in the desert of Judah. And so from that, we know that David is in the wilderness and that he's there because someone is after him and that his life is in danger and that his whole rhythm of living has been upended. I mean, he's living in a cave now, not in his house or his palace or wherever he might have been living before. He has to have people bring him food as opposed to growing it or buying it at the market. He's relying on others for that food. He has to be ready at any given moment to flee, to run somewhere else because people are after him. His whole rhythm of living has been disrupted. And in this first verse, you see that there's a tension here. The NIV says, "I thirst for you." Other translations have, "My soul thirsts for you." And you see this tension of wanting and longing God, but being in a place where he's not experiencing God. He's in a dry and parched land. He's in a dry and weary land. And no matter how much he longs for God, he doesn't seem to be experiencing it. The way he's living, the conditions he's facing, have dried out his soul. And that's not even the worst part. Go down to verse 2 now. In verse 2 it says, "I have seen you," and he's talking about God, "in the sanctuary, and beheld your power and your glory." Verse 2 is telling us that David is expressing a longing. He's thinking back to when he had experienced God, when he had been at the tabernacle. You see, being out in the wilderness meant that he was cut off from going to the tabernacle. He couldn't offer regular sacrifices. He couldn't go to the place where everyone knew the presence of God was. He couldn't experience God in that location. Being out in the wilderness, he was totally cut off from that. He was not able to be in the presence of God. Over the last number of years, one of my favorite things that I love to hear when I'm talking to new people is just to ask them about their impressions about SouthRidge. And one thing that has come up over and over and over again, and I love to hear it, is oftentimes when people would come to our services on a Sunday morning, they would say this kind of comment: I felt the presence of God when I came into SouthRidge for the very first time. And whether that was through the worship or the message or just interaction with the people, they had a palpable presence, a feeling that God was there with us. It was awesome. And I think this is what David is talking about in verse 2. He is missing that palpable presence that you get when you get together or go to God's sanctuary. And he's just missing that. And for us, I think some of that dryness that David is experiencing comes from not being able to go through his normal rhythm of worship, let alone his normal rhythm of life. And that's what David is expressing in verse 2. If you've driven by my house, for those of you who know where I live, recently and looked, you will have seen that my front lawn, most of it is dead. The heat wave that we just went through killed a good chunk of the grass. It is brown. But yet, beside these tall shrubs that I have off to one side of my lawn, there is still a patch of green because they were in the shade for most of the day when we had the heat wave. And this picture of what's happening with my lawn, I think, is a metaphor for how our souls are doing during COVID. You see, for some people, their souls are just dried out right now. For others, they're hanging in there. They may look green, but they're not really healthy. They're just kind of hanging on. See, one of the biggest drawbacks to not being able to get together as a church during COVID was that we couldn't worship together. We couldn't corporately come together and worship together. And that's one of the things that we've missed the most. Worship during COVID has been a challenge. And I think if many are truthful, they would just admit that they've actually stopped worshiping almost altogether. Oh, sure, they may listen to the message on a Sunday, but when the singing comes on their TV or their computer, they don't sing. They kind of just listen to it or maybe get up and grab a coffee to get ready for the announcements and the message. As we're going to see in a couple of moments, David points out that singing is actually an integral part of worship. And even for those of us who've tried to continue to worship as families, watching the service, it's just not the same. There is an awkwardness to trying to sing along with your TV or your computer screen. And it definitely does not give us that fullness of worship that we're normally used to. And I think for most of us, we miss that aspect of the presence of God when we gather together and worship together. And so I think most of us can relate to what David is saying in these first couple of verses. Our soul probably feels dried out because of this prolonged separation as the church body. And so what do we do about it? How did David handle it? Let me read verses 3 down to verse 8. It says this: because your love, and he's talking about God's love, is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest food. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. On my bed, I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night. Because you are my help, I sing in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you, your right hand upholds me. What is David saying here? I think what he's saying is this: worship is the remedy to soul weariness. Did you catch that? Worship is the remedy to soul weariness. David points out in these verses something that I think we often miss when it comes to worship. Worship needs to involve our whole body. Notice the first thing, it's your voice. Verses 3, verses 5, and verses 7. What does he say? He says, my lips will glorify you. That's your lips, your voice. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. Verse 7, I sing. All these things tell us that David is acknowledging that it's so important to verbally express our praise, to sing it out, to say it out. It's not just about thinking, it's about singing it. And here's the thing that sometimes we forget. One of the things we miss when we can't worship and sing together as a congregation is this. We don't hear others proclaiming truths that we believe. That's what we miss. You see, when we're singing together as a congregation and you hear someone else singing about the love of God or how much they love God and you're singing as well, you have this corporate affirmation of these truths. And I think it's impactful on us. It makes a huge impact on us. It's the same thing as the difference between thinking something and saying something out loud. There is a step that is involved in our brain that just makes it more concrete for us. When we move from just thinking it to saying it, and that's what singing does for us. It's not just about thinking about God or worshiping God in our thoughts. It's about actually verbalizing it, expressing it so that others can hear. And it changes how we feel. It does. But David doesn't stop there. He goes on to give us a second aspect of what it means to worship with our whole body. And he talks about physically worshiping God. And you see this in verse 4, where he says, in your name I lift my hands. If you do any studying of Hebrew and Greek words that are translated into worship, you will see that often many of those words have a physical component to it. One of the more common ones deals with this idea of bowing down when we're worshiping God. And so when you read the word worship or praise in the Old Testament and the New Testament, you have to have this idea that for the biblical people, the biblical audience that received these texts, for them to worship without their body, it would just seem weird. I think if we had Old Testament Jews or New Testament Christians come and visit us at SouthRidge and all they saw us was sitting down in a chair singing or standing there with our hands in our pockets or our arms crossed and not having our body as part of worship, they would just think it's strange and odd. There is something that happens, and this is what I feel when I worship, when I lift my hands up during worship. There is an expression that is just part of me, and I know for many of you that would push you a little bit beyond what you're comfortable with. But David says he lifts his hands up. There's a physical part of worship. It's more than just the verbal. There's a physical element of it. But he doesn't just stop with those two things. He also includes a third element of worship, and that has to do with our thoughts. And you see this in verse 6, where he talks about, on his bed I remember you. So he's at night lying down, he's remembering who God is and what he's done. And then it goes on to say, I think of you through the watches of the night. Meaning that when I read that verse, what I picture is him laying awake at night, not being able to sleep. Because that's what, right? Like normally if we have a good night's sleep, we don't wake up in the night. Right? Or at least if we do, we don't remember it. But what causes us to be awake in the middle of the night is when we have problems, when we have things going on, when we're anxious, when we're worried about something. And what I see David saying here in an attitude of worship, what we need to do is focus on who God is instead of the problem that's keeping us up in the middle of the night. Turn our thoughts towards God. Maybe you've heard this definition of what the difference is between religion and worship. Religion is a guy in church thinking about fishing. Worship is a guy who's fishing, who's thinking about God. And David is reminding us that there is other places and times that for us to worship God, we need to be thinking about who he is and what he's done for us and how much we love him. Not just in those moments when we come to a church building, or not just in those moments when we sit in front of a TV and watch a service. We need to be able to worship beyond that. So David is pointing out that worship is an integral part of his soul recovery. But how is David able to worship God in the middle of his wilderness? Remember, it's not like at the end of the psalm he leaves the cave. He's still out there. So how is he able to come to the place where he's actually able to worship God even though he's still in the wilderness? And you find this in verse 3. Verse 3 it says, because your love is better than life. When I first read that verse, it really struck me. I read it several times. Because your love is better than life. And as I was reading that verse, I thought to myself, do I really believe that? Do I think that God's love is better than life? And sometimes I think I'm tempted to say, I'm not sure. Because if I'm honest, there are parts of my life that are pretty good. I mean, life can be really awesome, especially like when we're on vacation and we're sitting by the lake or doing some fun stuff and not having to work. Like, life can be pretty good. This word life. And as I thought about my life, I thought about all the great things I have in my life, and whether it's my wife or my kids or my grandkids or my work that I am involved in, or even the privileges that come with living in a first world country, like having a medical system or an education system, or even the opportunity to get a good and decent job. All those things are good about my life. But when you really ponder your life, you realize that life is really pain, isn't it? That's what life is. Life is really pain. There are so many things that we gloss over. There's so many things that we cover up. But when we take a moment to sit down and evaluate our life, you realize that our life is full of sickness. Our life is full of broken relationships. Our life has sin, full of disappointments. I mean, even just this past week, some of the things on my prayer list that I was praying about is, a woman who lost her son and who hasn't been able to leave her house for weeks because of it. Or a man who seems to be in the final end stages of brain cancer and the suffering that's going along with that and the impact on his family. Or a marriage that has fallen apart and it doesn't look hopeful. There does not seem to be any possibility for reconciliation. Or a young woman who was sex trafficked but managed to escape. All of these things are difficult things. All these things point to sin or brokenness or hardship, grief. Life, if we're honest, is really about pain, isn't it? And sometimes I think we do such a good job of covering it up, of forgetting about it, of compartmentalizing the pain in our life, that we can kind of come to the place where we deceive ourselves into thinking this and believing this, that life is better than God's love. We get so focused on the things of life because we're trying to drown out the pain in it, that we actually believe that life is better than God's love. But it isn't. When you focus in on this word love that David uses, this love is translated in other places as mercy or even faithfulness, and it refers to God's covenantal love to his people, the Israelites. It refers to God's commitment to keep his promises. And then when you move to the New Testament, you see that this type of love is the love that brings to completion God's plan of salvation. This is the type of love that allows and compels God to send Jesus, his son, to die for us. It's this type of love that rescues us. It's this type of love that reminds us that we were created so that we could have an intimacy with God. You see, the irony of this statement is that it's God's love that actually allows us to truly experience life. It's God's love when we experience it, when we discover it, when we take hold of it, that when we experience God's love, that's when we actually truly find life. Jesus in John 10:10 says this statement, "The thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." And Jesus is acknowledging in this statement that without God's love, our end is destruction. It's separation from God. You see, the life that we really want, the life that we truly want, it gets stolen from us when we don't have God's love. But when we experience God's love, we also gain life. But if you know your New Testament, you realize that it's only through Jesus that we can experience fully God's love in our life. It's only through Jesus that we can have that life of abundance, that life of fullness. You see, at the end of this psalm, David is able to worship God in the wilderness because he knows that God's love is better than anything, any life he could orchestrate for himself. And he is going to rest in that love. He is going to rest in that situation. He's going to rest in God's hands. You see, David's situation hasn't changed at all. In verse 8, you find him clinging to God. That's what he says. He says, I will cling to you, and your right hand will uphold me. He's still in the wilderness. People are still after him. But he is able to come to the place where he says, I'm just going to rely on you, God. And you find out that through his worship, through his willingness to worship God, that his soul is fully satisfied. That's verse 5. I will be fully satisfied, or as some translations put it, my soul will be fully satisfied. Through worship, David is able to go from a place where he is dry, where he is weary, where he is thirsty, to a place where he is fully satisfied. So let me ask you this. Are you soul weary right now? You know, are you facing life that just seems to be an uphill battle? Are you in a place where you don't even feel close to God? Are you in a place where everything just seems hard? Are you in a place where you just want to lie down and give up? If you are, then you may be more than just physically weary. You may be soul weary. And I think if you're willing to take David's advice, to follow David's example, if you will just step into worship, if you'll just step into worshiping God with your whole being, you can arrive at the same place David arrived at. And that's having a soul that is satisfied. I encourage you, try David's remedy for weariness of the soul, worship. Start by remembering what God has done for you. Remember where you have met God in the past, where God has really been a presence in your life, where you've seen the power of God in your life or in those that are around you. Focus on those memories, those moments, and then move to a place where you are worshiping, where you're singing, where you're using your body in worship, where you're willing to come together. And I encourage you, if you haven't come in person to be with us, come and be with us and worship together corporately. That might be the biggest boost you can do for your soul weariness if you haven't done that yet. And then lastly, focus on God's love for you. No matter what you're facing, no matter how painful your life is right now, remember this, that if you focus on God's love, that's the thing that will save you. That's where we find our salvation. And ultimately, it's through God's love and through Jesus that we can find a life that is full and a life that we can live abundantly. Let me pray for you. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for this psalm. And Lord, I pray that even as I go through this weariness that I'm wrestling with and the struggle that I have with trying to have energy, Lord, may it not be because my soul is weary. Lord, help me, bring me to a place where I can praise you, I can sing, I can worship you with my whole being. Lord, fill my soul up. Lord, I pray for those who are listening who need this message as well. Lord, may they come to the place where they are worshiping you with their whole being. May they not stay in a place that is dry and weary. Create in them a thirst for you, Lord. Help them to discover that your love is better than life. In Jesus' name, amen.